Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Meter Cute interviews here on Meter and Mayhem. Today we'll be talking with Sandra Marchetti. She's the author of two full-length collections of poetry, including Aisle 228 from Stephen F. Austin State University Press, that is out this year right now, and Confluence from Sundress Publications in 2015. She's also the author of 4 chapbooks of poetry and lyric essays. Sandra's poetry appears widely in Poet Lore, Blackbird, Subtropics, Ecotone, Southwest Review, and elsewhere. Her essays can be found at The Rumpus, Whiskey Island, Mid-American Review, Barrel House, and other venues. Sandra earned an MFA in Creative Writing Poetry from George Mason University and serves as the Assistant Manager of Academic Support at Harper College in the Chicagoland area. So sit back, relax, and get ready to fall in love.
Hello, this is Sandra Marchetti. I'm going to read some poems from my new book, Aisle 228. I have a copy here. The book chronicles the Chicago Cubs, going to baseball games with my father and listening to baseball on the radio, also some other baseball history. And I'm just going to give you a little sample of that. This is the poem that starts off the book. It is called Frame. I wrote this poem in 2014. Tucked in the Western grandstand, imagine Wrigley. A sliver of light, orange-green beams gone between golden arches as scoreboard plates clink in place. The fourth inning haze filters the sun, a yoke yawning itself undone in the upper deck air to curve against each pillar, straining my gaze in aisle 228. My father gripes and wipes his nose through the April game, the team terrible again. Yet players lope over this green hill, and our minds agree to rise and clap for them. So if you remember the Chicago Cubs in 2014, they were terrible. I don't know why you would remember them, but it was the beginning, later in the season, let's put it that way, it was the beginning of hope for the team that eventually won the World Series in 2016. But at that time, sitting there on opening day, it felt pretty dismal. This next poem is an homage to one of our favorite baseball characters, many of you might know from Major League, or Mr. Belvedere, Bob Uecker. Listening for Bob Uecker. My father thinks you can find a signal from anywhere. A Mets game in Cincinnati, the Reds in Tennessee. I tell him sometimes the mountains curtain the call, or a semi bleeding its long, low horn, its light scanning the corn. But 50,000 watts fighting Dolly Parton or a revival travels. When it's clear, you can hear the Dodgers in Chicago and know a wave arrayed in the distance spun out its curve to find you. So something that maybe in a nostalgic seeming collection of baseball poems you would wonder about is, are they going to talk about the real experience of going to a baseball game, which is dirty and sweaty and kind of a pain sometimes. So I did write a poem, several poems about that part of it. This one I slapped a French title on to make it seem a little bit fancier. But it is about the grime at the ballpark, denouement. Beer on the bricks and cheap meat, piss that brines the seat and the frame as we exit the park at the end of the game. A dozen doors thwack open, dull as scrapped cups. Through the clatter, a popcorn vendor crams his bags in the trash. We meet in a square of air below the stairs to curse and bless, sopped with sweat. Hands grimed on tunnel walls, slathered in mustard and ads, shuffle us from the cube in sun, ants pressed away from the day. And I'll read a few more. This book is divided into two sections. It's divided into a losers section, which is appropriate for the Chicago Cubs, who didn't win a World Series for over 100 years. And then there's the winners section. So this is the last poem in the losers section, Over Sheffield Avenue. And this is dedicated to the historian of Major League Baseball, John Thorne. He wrote a book called Baseball in the Garden of Eden. And I just, as any good poet does, I had to steal that title and use it as a line. I'm playing baseball in the Garden of Eden. Scratch that. I'm writing baseball in the Garden of Eden, where old cars ride street corner curves in our square city, while vendors hawk peanuts. I'm writing baseball out of the Garden of Eden. Clouds sail the blue gold lake, a tincture Titian never mastered. Players skim the surface grass in pinstriped cottons, blue hats, blue socks, blue numbers. I'm writing baseball out of the garden. I touch the field to liquefy it, prism painted deftly on my eye. I'm writing baseball as it never was, from a Sunday on which we won it all. Okay, I'm gonna read a couple from the winners section. And I think it's sort of a, how do I say this? A legal requirement, if you're gonna write about the game of baseball, that you have to have a father and son playing catch poem or a two boys playing catch poem. I'm pretty sure Major League Baseball or the Saber Committee will hunt you down and, fine you if you don't. So even though I am not a boy or a father, I did write one. And this is called Twilight. Some young men play catch in a field, call each other on balls and strikes. How can they possibly know? Dancing through the grass, one high, then low, and up again, just outside. The seams slap old leather. How can we know where the strike zone is? Imaginary cube, filament I could not hold in my hand. I asked, how can you tell? And my father said, watch, you'll learn, you'll know. They play rhythmic and swift until the young men are gone. And I think I'll just read two more here. I think I'm going to read a poem about one of my favorite players, and he was never on the Cubs, but this book kind of dabbles in other baseball history, and Ichiro Suzuki is the global hit king. He has more hits than any other player, including Pete Rose, if you combine his statistics in Japan and in the US. And he's sort of a mythical character. He goes by one name, Ichiro. No one calls him Ichiro Suzuki, actually. So I wrote a poem about him as maybe a character from the Odyssey, maybe a siren, maybe a merman. So this is myth for Ichiro. Part of it is him rising from the sea of Japan again, a siren who whispers, never die. We want to believe in permanence, the not quite going, the falling back into the waves and surfacing, spring after spring, walking the sand in his cleats. And I'm going to do one final poem. And if I can pull it up here. And this one is a bit of a nightmare, but I think it's important to, I don't know, talk about these things. So, when the Cubs were winning that World Series in 2016, I had a series of nightmares about it never happening and it not being real. And so I wrote about that. And it starts with a quote from Harry Carey, the Cubs Hall of Fame broadcaster. "The good Lord wants the Cubs to win. I dreamt you rewound the last play that evening. Our fortunes changed and took it away. In the nightmare, you led the trophy back from the owner's hands to the commissioner's grasp. Then Bryant slipped and missed the ball, his smile twisted to torture. Or maybe he threw, but the seams popped loose from Rizzo's mitt, 2 on, 2 out. Either way, you shifted it from our grasp and settled its heft back onto your lap. Thank you so much."
Wow, Sandy, that was great. Thank you so much for reading. One of the things that I really loved about this particular collection, I don't follow baseball at all. And one of the things that I love is that you don't have to know anything about baseball, and you can still be pulled in by those feelings of connection and desire and everything that's coming through in the poems. It's about baseball, but it's also about so much more than baseball, right? Ah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for reading. So I'm going to ask you now about other folks' work. What is either a metrical poem or a metrical poet who you love?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go with a really obvious answer here, although there are a few I'll sort of mention. But I'm going to start off at the source, or near near the source, with Gerard Manley Hopkins. Um, so I didn't think metrics were fun in grad school. I really, we all had that forms of poetry class where you had to write the sestina and the sonnet and all these sorts of things. And I was really bad at it. I couldn't scan. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd get really nervous. People show me all these tricks with my mouth and all this stuff, and I couldn't figure it out. But then when I read Gerard Manley Hopkins and kind of heard about the theory of sprung rhythm, I was like, I can get behind this, because even though we know that not every syllable can be stressed, I can see what he was going for there. So it unlocked this whole world for me of spondies. And I love to use spondies in my work now. But I really am interested in kind of how we reshuffle words and the rhythms that we see versus what we hear, because I like kind of messing with that idea of what's on the page and what looks like metrical poetry versus what sounds like metrical poetry. Like the poems I read, when you hear them out loud, you'll probably feel a sense of rhythm. However, if you look at them, they're not written in long enough lines to even be, some people would say they're not scannable at all, but it's all about the way that they're sort of the way you hear them. So with Hopkins, I think too, he allows for these interpretations in the way other poets don't. I like that idea of controversy. I also like poets, people will also, I'm a big Elizabeth Bishop fan, and people will cite her poems that are truly metrical, like The Moose or One Art or whatever. But a poem like At the Fish Houses, or a poem like Poem, which, I think they kind of go in and out of rhythm, or they have a refrain like At the Fish Houses has one line that's very metrical, and it's a refrain: cold, dark, deep, and absolutely clear. And so I like kind of the idea of that too, like sort of using metrics as a tool to kind of surface or ground a poem, like, and it not necessarily being the whole poem.
Mm.
I don't know.
Yeah, like just a little
Yeah.
treat thrown in.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I can talk more about how I use it, but I think those have been some of my guideposts, you know, and there are other poets that I think, you know, Sharon Olds is kind of a good example of like the line breaks don't look like the poems don't really look metrical, but if you read them out loud, they're kind of scannable. And I like that idea of kind of like or even John Ashbery is another example of like zoning in and out of like a metrical form.
Yeah. Well, and I think if I'm remembering right, and I would not stake my life on this, but thinking about William Carlos Williams and the Red Wheelbarrow,
Yeah.
I think that that is a single line of iambic pentameter, but it's broken out
There you
differently.
go.
I think. Now I'll go look it up later, and I'll put it in the description if I'm completely wrong.
I hadn't
I'll put
heard
it.
that, but it makes a lot of sense now that you're saying it. So I hope that that's true.
So Gerard Manley Hopkins sort of brought you into
Mm.
metrical poetry. You mentioned that you had trouble scanning and stuff.
Yeah.
Have you tried to scan again, or like how do you do with scansion?
Well, I don't really like I don't really use traditional scansion because I still find like the more I think about it, the worse it goes. So I don't use the traditional methods, but you know, I think for me, because that was so hard for me, it really helped me. Though that like original class that I hated and reading all those metrical boats, because it started to get the rhythms into my brain. So like when I take a walk or hear a clock or hear a sound, a natural sound, you know, a bird call or an alarm or whatever, I will usually use sounds as the genesis of the poem rather than, you know, I have this story I want to tell or I have this observation. Sounds will oftentimes start me off and I'll be like, how can I describe that sound? And I do memorize some of my poems, and I also like to walk and be outside and be thinking about my lines. So it's not as Thoreau-esque as I'm, you know, making it out to be, but just that idea of kind of doing something and writing in my head is really useful for me. And I think also I pick and choose things from meter that I want to use. Like before, when I was saying these other poets and how they're kind of weaving in and out of meter, like I really enjoy the idea of using lots of assonance or lots of consonants in my poems, or I like making my lines a similar length, even if they're not necessarily scannable in a typical way. Or I like to lots of internal rhymes in I try to use a lot of internal rhymes. That stuff delights me. I really see poems as puzzles. I really enjoy that aspect of it. I like having inside jokes in my poems. Like this sounds elitist, but like inside jokes in my poems that people might not see right away, you know, and some of those things are metrical, like, or they're they're grounded in some sort of sonic treat. So, and I use a technique called sound mapping, which is a really easy way in to meter. This was something that I started doing when I was trying to work my way out of that grad school haze, which is just like circling all the words with certain sounds in them, you know, and going vowels first and then consonants, like all the S's, all the A's, and like kind of the connotation of those sounds and thinking about them, like poems that I love. Like one I I was just talking about on another podcast, Lee Young Lee's Eating Alone. Like, you can tell the tone of the poem changes because of they go from mostly A sounds to mostly O sounds. And there's like a lot more longing and there's a lot more pain in those O sounds than the A sounds. The A sounds there's much more action in those lines. So just kind of like looking at the sounds and the progression of the sounds is very helpful for me.
Wow, I had never thought to sort of like full on visualize it in that
Yeah.
way. I can see where that could be really helpful.
Yeah, and like I mentioned the moose earlier, but that's another poem where like you can see based on the vowel sounds that she uses or the consonant sounds, like the poem gets faster or slower or whatever, like the rhythm, you can feel the rhythm through just looking at the different types of sounds and the variants. So it was useful to me because for me, trying to tap something out or scan it in a typical way just wasn't working. So
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I should say this or not. I feel like the statute of limitations has run out, so I can say this. That I was so bad about being able to tell where stresses are in words that in high school we had weekly vocabulary tests. And some of the words for the pronunciation section, you would have to mark where the stresses were. And I could not do the stresses without like having to say the word as many different ways, right? Like,
yeah.
to see, well, is it on the first? Is it on the second? Second, which one sounds right? And I would have to do that out loud and I couldn't do it. So I had somebody who was in one of the other classes, wouldn't tell me the answers, but would tell me which words were going to be on the test so that I could memorize where the stresses were.
Wow.
But I'm pretty sure the statute of limitations has run out on that at
I
this
think
point.
so. High school.
I was a kid. I was
But
young.
that's how confounding it can be. And then I remember finding out, like, again, I'm 23 years old at the time or whatever, and finding out that, well, depending on how it's used in the sentence, the stresses can change. I'm just like,
yeah,
I hate you, like.
well, I mean, when you think about stresses, when people talk about meter, there will often say the sort of small throwaway words don't get stressed, like and the. But when you read Longfellow,
Yeah,
he relies heavily on stressing words like and of. And you're like, gosh darn it, what the, what are the rules here? But really, it's about your heart and what comes out, man.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that I really love doing is having those two unstressed and a stressed syllable. I use that format a lot in my poems. I end lines with that. Maybe it's a bad habit. Maybe I do it too much, but I think the more that we can sort of invite people in to meter and make it less scary and say, like, there is a way for you to dabble with this without having to go full ball and basically only writing in given forms, that's a good thing.
Yeah. And I what sort of made the big difference for me was in working with Annie Finch, she talks about something called enrhythming. And it's, you pick a poem that's in the meter that you want to write in, and then you just read that poem over and over and over again.
Yes.
And then you dive in. And it was something that I was sort of kind of doing already. And I was like, oh, there's a term for it. And there's like, people do this, it's a thing. And I cannot sit down and say, like, I'm going to write an iambic pentameter. If I try to do that, there's a no-go. It's frustrating all around. But if I read a poem,
yes,
and like for 15 minutes and then dive in, it comes out so much better for me.
Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense because we think about, like, if you're from the South and you go back to the South, you get that accent again. Or if you are talking to someone and you pick up on some cool slang that they use, you might then use it in your next conversation. So it just makes sense that something like that would work. So
Yeah.
that's a cool, I didn't know it had a name, but I like that idea.
Yeah, I mean, at least that's what Annie calls it. It used to be something else for she's changed the name a few times, but I think in rhythming is what
And
she's
rhythming.
is what she's sticking with
Very
now.
cool.
So, um, so we're kind of getting, I feel like we're kind of moving into an advice sort of section.
Mm,
So I'm kind of curious, you've talked a little bit about your time in your MFA program and as
yes.
a younger poet,
Yes.
what kind of advice would you give if you had your little time machine and you could go back and not mess up the space-time continuum or anything, or if you ran into somebody now who's going through the same thing, what kind of
Mm.
advice would you give to folks?
Well, I think one thing I would say is like, this is painful but necessary. Because at the time I was like, writing in all these forms is stupid and I'm not going to write in them. Late, I know I'm not going to write in them, but I'm glad that like where I went to school and what I had to read and all that stuff was very rigorous, because let's be honest, I wasn't going to do that outside on my own time. And this isn't like a commercial for grad school, because I think some people are so good at that. Like they will do that on their own, but that was not going to be me. So it was painful but necessary, and I really learned a lot, because I had to start thinking about my work and how I could make my work kind of do some of these things just to like complete assignments. And one thing that I didn't have the courage to do at the time, but I really have gotten into since then, is like nonce forms. Love my nonce forms, love coming up with weird forms for things. And just going with it and doing like a fake it till you make it. Like, oh yeah, that's a sonnet. Like, when it really doesn't look like one, but I can justify it, or that, I took a translation class and I translated some poetry, and it was very, very loosely translated, but saying that's a translation, I did it, like, and just kind of having that a little more confidence, which maybe it wouldn't have been possible at the time, but just, if you have an idea for something, I would tell people to try it. Like, don't be too concerned about what people are going to think. Maybe impossible, but when you get home, it's just you and your writing, and so I would just say try it. I wish at the time I had just said to myself, well, this is gonna work, instead of being like, oh, this is too weird, or this doesn't really fit the assignment. It's creative writing school. Like, just go ahead, you know so
And
like, yeah,
it's just paper or computer files. It's not like we're
yeah,
carving things in marble. So if it doesn't work out,
yeah,
okay, that's it. Just
yeah.
try.
And a lot of that has to do with like the perfectionism of my 20s, as well, but I just don't, there was really no need for that. But I do think, um since those days, I think there has been definitely an opening, to even more different types and styles and whatever you want to call a poem. And we were starting to get there in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, but not quite yet. So
Yeah. Um, and I think I mean, I don't know where you went to grad school was, but when you're in school, whatever the going vibe is of the program, whatever the aesthetic of the program
oh yeah,
is, I look back at stuff from grad school and almost don't recognize the voice in them because it
yeah,
was so far from like who I actually, I mean, it's not like so far from who I actually am, but it was, but yeah, just piggybacking on what you were saying about opening up to different styles
hmm
and
and I
sometimes,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So what kind of advice do you think that younger Sandy would give to you now?
Well, I'll be very blunt with myself and tell myself to read more. Because I don't read as much anymore. The vibe of my program was very language poet kind of vibe, or post language poet kind of vibe. And I don't read that stuff anymore, but I think it was really good to stretch and grow me. And I think it can be very easy. Like one of the great things about going to school is like you do things that you might never otherwise do, and then you come home and sort of incorporate that into your voice. But I think, now I'm at a place where I really need to think about what is well, there's this quote by Dave Smith, and I always tell people this. The quote is "No threat, no poem." And I think the idea is like there has to be something at stake. And I think I can very easily write poems that are pleasant, or they might be about awe or pleasure, but there's not that much at stake. And I think I really need to remember that. Like if I'm writing something down that I'm going to share with people, it's a marker. There's got to be some importance there. And I can decide what that is. It doesn't have to be the poem that ends a war. But it just needs to be, there needs to be something there that's at stake. And, I think my younger self probably knew that better than my older self.
Interesting.
Yeah. Even if I was a bit more overdramatic then.
I think, weren't we all though, right?
We all were. But I did think I had the poem that was going to end a war, back then. So I need like 10% of that now. Yeah.
Did that poem ever get published anywhere? I feel like I want to.
A metaphorical poem, but
Oh,
yeah, I'm sure it did.
well, I think about when I was younger, I feel like every poem I wrote, like thinking about in undergrad specifically, that I was so sure that I could like, I feel like the term I was about to use is used in a different way now, so I have to think about it. Basically, that I would shake everybody out of hegemony.
Right.
That if I could just show everybody how the world is working, you guys, we don't have to do these things. You don't have to wear
mind blowing.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, to be young and so like I feel like I am in some ways more confident now.
Yeah.
But I feel like I had a lot of just beautifully unearned confidence in college, and so
you had a lot of juice. You had a lot of juice, and so did I. I think we're more comfortable being ourselves now. Like, and if there's something weird we want to try, or at least for me, I'm like, yeah, I knew back then I wanted to write a book of baseball poems, but I said that's kind of ridiculous. I better write this book of like nature poems and get this published first, which great. I was invested in that, but I didn't think I could get away with doing what I wanted to do. But later on, I realized I could. So
do you feel okay, here's how I'm going to phrase it. I had an aunt who was a sports reporter in the like 80s. And she would talk about how difficult it had been for her as a woman in sports reporting.
Yes.
Do you feel that as a woman writing about baseball, did that affect your feeling that you could write about baseball, and you're sort of talking yourself out of it, that you were like, it's a dude's thing, or at all?
Well, I knew it wasn't a dude's thing, but I didn't want the heat. I didn't want the blowback that I knew would be coming from all those people who said it was a dude's thing. Kudos to your aunt, by the way. I mean, that must have really been tough. I think the whole sports journalism business and sports writing business is still one of the least equitable places to be as far as a career in the world, because they're at a place where they think that white women entering their sphere is diversity. And there's almost that the bar is not that low pretty much anywhere else. So it's tough, right? I have a lot of privilege, and so I'm lucky to be able to have taken on whatever blowback I was going to get. But I was worried. I was worried people were not going to listen to me. We're going to discount my voice. We're going to come to readings and like pepper me with trivia questions so that I could earn my place. And some of that has happened. But what I will tell you is a lot of people are more generous than I thought they were going to be. And yes, that includes a lot of men. Because I think that this is something that we share. And it's crazy to think that people who have told me, like, I haven't picked up a book since high school, are willing to read a book of poems because it's about their favorite thing. So I feel like I've gotten really lucky. I feel like I've made a lot of friendships over social media, specifically on Twitter during the good days of Twitter, with tons of sports fans where we were live tweeting, during games when things weren't going well, and we all became pretty close. And those people really showed up for me when I published this book, and they wanted to buy it and read it. And I was blessed. And then, I think the poetry community, I was worried about them chastising as well. But I think, I don't know if there's been as great of a response from the poetry community as from the sports community, but I think the poetry community has at least recognized that you can write poems about this and they can still be real poems, which I was worried about, because there's so many poets that I talk to that call, any sporting event sports ball and think it's stupid. But I think, even like you said, if you are not interested in the game, there's still something that you can find in the poems. And so I've been tremendously lucky with audiences, but I probably wasn't ready to share this with people. When I first started writing these poems 10 years ago, I would say that I was a little apprehensive. But then trying to find a publisher for many, many years once the book was done got me to the point where I was like, I don't even care about the reception. Let's just get it out there. So that helped too.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you were able to get it out there and that you did decide to go forward with it. And so we have this great book in the world. So thanks for coming and talking to me about it today.
Of course. So appreciate your questions and your stories. It's been great to talk about meter and poetry and all these things we love.
What a fun interview that was. I hope that you've fallen in love a little bit with Sandra Marchetti's work, as well as Gerard Manley Hopkins and Elizabeth Bishop. Thanks for stopping by.